Picture this. It's 1982. Paul McCartney sits alone at his piano. His fingers find familiar chords, but the words that come out shake him to his core. For the first time in 2 years, he's ready to talk to John Lennon, but John can't hear him anymore. The song he writes becomes Here Today, a conversation with a ghost, a conversation filled with things he never got to say when his friend was alive. And even now, at 82 years old, Paul admits something that might surprise you. This song still makes him cry. Everyone thinks they know the Beatles story. The fame, the breakup, the bitter words in the press. But what really happened between Paul and John in those final years? What was Paul thinking during those long, silent months when they weren't speaking? And why does a 3-minute song written 40 years ago still break down one of the world's most famous musicians? The answer isn't what you think. It's darker, more personal, and more heartbreaking than any headline ever captured. What Paul reveals about Here Today changes everything we thought we knew about the end of the Beatles and about friendship itself. But first, let me ask you this. Have you ever had words you wished you could take back, or things you never got the chance to say? Because that's where this story really begins. If stories like this hit you right in the heart, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button for Retro Waves, where we uncover the real stories behind music's biggest moments. December 8, 1980, the phone call that changed Paul McCartney's world forever. John's been shot. Those 3 words ended everything. Not just John Lennon's life, but any chance Paul had to fix what had been broken between them for years. See, the public saw the Beatles breakup as business, legal fights over Apple Records, arguments about who controlled their music, cold, calculated stuff. But behind closed doors, it was personal, really personal. Paul and John had been best friends since they were teenagers. They wrote songs together in each other's bedrooms. They shared dreams of becoming famous. They conquered the world side by side. Then it all fell apart. By 1970, they weren't just bandmates who split up. They were former friends who couldn't stand to be in the same room. John called Paul's music Muzak in Rolling Stone magazine. Paul shot back through his own songs and interviews. The press ate it up. For 10 whole years, they barely spoke. 10 years of cold shoulders, missed opportunities, and wounded pride. Sure, there were moments when the ice seemed to thaw. John would call Paul occasionally. They'd talk about their kids, their lives. But the old friendship, that seemed gone forever. Paul wanted to reach out more. Friends who knew them both say he tried. But John was unpredictable. Some days he'd be warm and funny like the old days. Other days he'd hang up on Paul or refuse to take his calls. Then came that December night in 1980. A deranged fan named Mark David Chapman waited outside John's apartment building in New York. When John came home, Chapman shot him 4 times. John Lennon died at Roosevelt Hospital at 11:07 p.m. He was 40 years old. Paul was devastated, but here's what really ate him alive. All those things he never got to say. The apologies that never came. The laughs they never shared again. The friendship they never got to rebuild. For 2 years, Paul couldn't even talk about John publicly without breaking down. But what finally broke Paul's silence? And why did he choose to pour his heart out in a song instead of an interview? The answer reveals something about grief that most people never understand. After John died, something strange happened to Paul McCartney. The man who never met a microphone he didn't like went completely quiet. Friends say Paul locked himself away for weeks. He couldn't listen to Beatles music. He couldn't even look at old photos without falling apart. But the worst part? The guilt. Paul blamed himself for how things ended. Their last real conversation hadn't been about music or family. It had been another argument, another missed chance to make things right. Linda McCartney, Paul's wife, watched her husband disappear into himself. She told reporters years later that Paul would sit at the piano for hours, starting songs about John, then walking away without finishing them. He'd play a few notes, get this look in his eyes, and just stop. Linda remembered. It was like the words were too heavy to get out. The press kept asking Paul for comments about John's death. They wanted quotes, memories, anything. Paul gave them almost nothing. When he did speak, it came out all wrong. One reporter caught him outside his house just hours after John died. Paul said something about it being a drag, and immediately regretted it. The comment made headlines, making Paul look cold when he was actually destroyed inside. That comment haunted Paul for months. People thought he didn't care. They thought the old Beatles rivalry meant Paul was glad John was gone. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Paul's friends from that time say he was broken. Ringo Starr visited him and found Paul crying over old Beatles footage. George Harrison called to check on him. Both said they'd never seen Paul so lost. But here's the thing about Paul McCartney. He processes everything through music, always has. When he's happy, he writes happy songs. When he's angry, he writes angry songs. When he's heartbroken, well, that's when he writes his most honest songs. But this time was different. This time the song he needed to write scared him. Why? What was Paul so afraid of putting into music? Paul McCartney had written hundreds of songs by 1982. Love songs, protest songs, silly songs, deep songs. But he'd never written a song to a dead person before, and that's exactly what Here Today needed to be. The problem was, Paul didn't know how to do it without falling apart completely. Every time he sat down to write about John, the emotions overwhelmed him. This wasn't just about missing a friend. This was about unfinished business. See, Paul and John's friendship had layers most people never saw. They weren't just songwriting partners. They were like brothers who grew up in public with all the love and rivalry that brings. In the early days, they were inseparable. John was the cool, sharp-tongued rebel. Paul was the diplomatic charmer. They balanced each other perfectly. But as the Beatles got bigger, cracks started showing. John wanted the band to be more experimental, more political. Paul wanted them to stay accessible, more commercial. Both were right, but they couldn't agree. The real breaking point came during the Let It Be sessions in 1969. Those recording sessions were a disaster. The band was tired, stressed, and fighting constantly. Paul tried to hold things together by being the leader. John saw this as Paul trying to control everything. They argued in the studio. They argued about money. They argued about Yoko Ono being there during recording. John felt like Paul didn't respect his opinions anymore. Paul felt like John had checked out of the band emotionally. The worst fight happened off camera, but people who were there remember it. John accused Paul of thinking he was better than the rest of them. Paul shot back that at least he still cared about the Beatles. They barely spoke during the recording of Abbey Road the next year. By the time Paul announced he was leaving the Beatles in 1970, their friendship was already dead. For the next decade, that fight hung over everything. Every interview, every new song, every public appearance, people compared them and picked sides. But now John was gone, and Paul realized he'd never get to take any of it back. So why did it take him 2 full years to finally write Here Today? What was he waiting for? Spring of 1982, Paul was working on his Tug of War album in his home studio. He'd been avoiding anything that reminded him of John, but something shifted that day. Maybe it was because enough time had passed. Maybe it was because he was tired of carrying the weight alone. Or maybe it was because Linda finally said what he needed to hear. Talk to him, she told Paul. Just talk to him like he's sitting right there. So Paul did something he hadn't done since they were teenagers writing songs together. He imagined John was in the room with him. Not the angry John from the breakup years, not the distant John from their final phone calls. The John he remembered from Hamburg and Liverpool. The John who laughed at his jokes and finished his sentences. The melody came first, like it usually did for Paul. Soft, gentle, almost like a lullaby. Nothing fancy or complicated, just honest. Then came the hardest part, the words. Paul started simple. He imagined sitting across from John, just the two of them. No cameras or reporters or lawyers. What would he say? The first lines he wrote were questions. Questions about John's life, his family, his music. But underneath those questions was the real question Paul was too scared to ask directly. Do you forgive me? What made this song different from anything Paul had written before was the conversation format. He wasn't just singing about John, he was singing to John. Paul would ask a question in one verse, then pause, like he was waiting for John to answer. Then he'd continue the conversation, sometimes even imagining what John might say back. Friends who heard early versions of the song said it gave them chills. It really did sound like Paul was talking to someone who was there in the room. But Paul wasn't done yet. He wanted to address the elephant in the room, all those years of silence between them. This was the part that made Paul break down every time he tried to sing it. What did Paul say in that song that still makes him cry 40 years later? The most heartbreaking part of Here Today isn't what Paul says, it's what he admits he never said when John was alive. In the song, Paul essentially confesses that he was too proud to reach out. too stubborn to make the first move toward rebuilding their friendship. He sings about wondering what John would think of his new music, his life, his family. Simple things that friends share with each other all the time. But Paul and John never got to share those things after 1970. The song becomes Paul's way of having all the conversations they missed. 10 years worth of conversations compressed into 3.5 minutes. But here's the part that breaks Paul down every time. He admits in the song that he knew John was struggling. See, by 1980, John wasn't doing well. He'd been out of the music business for 5 years, raising his son Sean. He was having problems with depression, with drugs, with feeling like his best work was behind him. Paul knew this. They had mutual friends who told him John was having a hard time. Part of Paul wanted to call, to reach out, to be the friend John needed, but their history was so complicated. Paul was afraid John would think he was calling out of pity, or that John would just hang up on him like he had before, so Paul waited. He thought there would be time later. He thought eventually they'd both be ready to fix things. Then there was no more time. In Here Today, Paul sings directly about this regret. He talks about having so much to tell John, so much to ask him, but he also acknowledges that John might have had things to tell him too, things Paul will never get to hear. The song is filled with what-ifs and if-onlys. What if he'd called one more time? What if he'd swallowed his pride sooner? Recording the song was torture for Paul. His voice would crack, he'd have to stop and start over. The whole thing took weeks because he could barely get through it without crying. But that wasn't even the hardest part about making Here Today. The hardest part was deciding whether to release it at all. Paul finished recording Here Today in March of 1982. Then he sat on it for months. He played it for Linda first. She cried. Then he played it for his producer, George Martin, the same man who had produced the Beatles. Martin was quiet for a long time after hearing it. "It's beautiful, Paul," Martin finally said, "but are you sure you want the whole world to hear this?" That was the question that kept Paul up at night. Here Today was the most personal song he'd ever written. It was like reading someone's private diary. Paul worried that people would think he was trying to cash in on John's death. The press had been brutal about everything related to the Beatles since the breakup. They'd twist this into another story about rivalry and money. He also worried about Yoko Ono, John's widow. How would she feel about Paul having this one-sided conversation with her dead husband? Would she think Paul was being selfish? Paul called Yoko before releasing the song. That conversation, according to friends who knew both of them, was difficult but necessary. Yoko told Paul she understood what the song meant to him. She said John would have wanted Paul to express his feelings, but she also asked Paul to be prepared for how people might react. "Some people won't understand," she warned him. "They'll think you're trying to have the last word." Paul knew she was right, but he also knew he had to release the song, not for the public, not for his career, but for himself. "I needed to say goodbye properly," Paul explained to friends at the time. "I never got to do that." So in April of 1982, Here Today was included on the Tug of War album. Paul did almost no interviews about it. He let the song speak for itself. The reaction was immediate and intense, but it wasn't at all what Paul expected. What happened when the world finally heard Paul's conversation with John's ghost? When Here Today was released, something beautiful happened. Instead of criticism, Paul received thousands of letters from fans around the world. They weren't just Beatles fans. They were people who had lost friends, parents, siblings, spouses, people who understood exactly what Paul was going through. The song gave them permission to grieve openly, to admit they had regrets, to acknowledge that sometimes we lose people before we get to say everything we need to say. Radio stations started playing Here Today during memorial segments. Funeral homes asked Paul's permission to use it in services. Grief counselors recommended it to their clients. Paul was amazed. He'd thought the song was too personal, too specific to his situation with John. Instead, it became universal. The music critics were mostly kind too. They understood that this wasn't Paul trying to get attention. This was a man working through genuine grief in the only way he knew how. Even some of John's friends from New York, who had been suspicious of Paul's motives, came around. They could hear the real pain in Paul's voice. They knew he wasn't acting, but the most meaningful response came from someone unexpected, John Lennon, John's son with Yoko. Sean was only 5 when his father died, but years later, when he was old enough to understand the song, he reached out to Paul. "Thank you for missing my dad," Sean told Paul during a chance meeting in the 1990s. "It means a lot that you still think about him." That moment, Paul later said, meant more to him than any review or chart position ever could. But Here Today wasn't just a one-time tribute. It became something Paul would carry with him for the rest of his life. And that's where the story gets really interesting, because Paul's relationship with this song didn't end in 1982, it's still going on today. And what Paul says about it now, at 82 years old, might surprise you. Fast forward to 2022. Paul McCartney is 80 years old, still touring, still making music. He's been performing for over 6 decades. He's sung thousands of songs in front of millions of people, but there's one song he still can't get through without crying. Here Today. In recent interviews, Paul admits something that shows just how deep his connection to this song goes. He says that every time he performs it, and he's performed it hundreds of times over the past 40 years, he feels like John is actually there listening. It's the strangest thing, Paul told a BBC interviewer in 2022. I'll be singing it, and I swear I can feel John's presence. Not in a spooky way, just like he's finally hearing what I wanted to tell him. But here's what makes Paul cry every single time. It's not the sad parts of the song that break him down, it's the hopeful parts. See, Here Today isn't just about regret and grief. Hidden in the song is Paul's belief that somehow, somewhere, John is okay, that maybe John understands now what Paul was trying to do all those years they weren't speaking. Paul sings about how he hopes John found peace, how he hopes John knew deep down that Paul never stopped caring about him as a friend. That hope, that faith that love survives even death, is what destroys Paul emotionally every time. I get to the part where I'm telling him I love him, Paul explained in 2023, and it hits me that I never got to say that when he was alive. We were guys from Liverpool in the 1960s. We didn't say I love you to each other back then. But I should have. I should have told him. The song has become Paul's way of maintaining his friendship with John across time and death. It's not just a memorial, it's an ongoing conversation. Paul has updated the song slightly over the years too. In recent performances, he's added little ad-libs, like he's responding to things John might have said. He'll pause after certain lines, like he's listening for John's voice. Audience members who've seen Paul perform Here Today recently say it's unlike anything else in his catalog. The 82-year-old rock legend becomes completely vulnerable on stage. His voice shakes. His eyes fill with tears. Sometimes he has to stop and collect himself before continuing. But he always finishes the song. Always. I owe it to him, Paul says, and I owe it to myself. It's the most honest thing I've ever written. The song has also changed how Paul thinks about all his relationships. He's become more direct about telling people he loves them, more willing to apologize when he's wrong, more conscious that every conversation could be the last one. John taught me that, Paul says, even after he was gone. Through that song, he taught me not to wait to say the important things. But there's one more layer to this story that Paul only revealed recently. Something about Here Today that makes it even more powerful than anyone knew. In 2023, Paul McCartney revealed something about Here Today that he'd never shared publicly before. He didn't write the song just for John. He wrote it for everyone who's ever lost someone important before saying goodbye properly. I realized while I was writing it that I wasn't the only person carrying around that kind of regret, Paul explained. Everyone has someone they wish they could talk to one more time. That's why the song has endured for over 40 years. That's why it still makes people cry at Paul's concerts. That's why grief counselors still recommend it to people working through loss. Paul accidentally created an anthem for unfinished business, but the song also taught Paul something he didn't expect. It taught him that love doesn't end with death. Every time I sing Here Today, I feel closer to John than I did in the last years of his life, Paul admits. It's like the song broke down all the walls we'd built between us, all the stupid arguments, all the hurt feelings. None of that matters anymore. What matters is the friendship we had and the music we made together. Paul has performed Here Today at some of the most important concerts of his career. He sang it at the concert for New York after 9/11. He performed it during his induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. He chose it as one of the songs for his carpool karaoke session with James Corden. Each time the song serves a different purpose. Sometimes it's a memorial, sometimes it's a celebration, sometimes it's just Paul working through his emotions in front of thousands of people. The song has also helped heal other relationships in Paul's life. After writing Here Today, Paul made sure to reconcile with people he'd been distant from. He reached out to old friends. He had difficult conversations with family members. "I never want to write another song like Here Today," Paul says, "because I never want to lose someone again without telling them everything I need to tell them." Today, Paul McCartney is one of the few people alive who truly understands what it was like to be a Beatle. Ringo is still around, but George Harrison passed away in 2001. Paul is largely alone with those memories now, but he's not bitter about it. If anything, Here Today taught him to be grateful for the time he had with his friends, not regretful about the time he lost. "The song gave me my friendship with John back," Paul says. "I know that sounds crazy, but it's true. Writing it, singing it all these years, it healed something that I thought was broken forever." And maybe that's the real power of Here Today. It's proof that it's never too late to say what needs to be said, even if the person you need to say it to can only hear you in a song. Paul McCartney's Here Today reminds us that some conversations are too important to leave unfinished, even if we have to finish them alone. What do you think? Is there someone in your life you need to have a conversation with before it's too late? Let us know in the comments below. And if stories like this one hit you deep, make sure you're subscribed to Retro Waves. We dig into the real human stories behind music's biggest moments, the ones that remind us why these songs matter so much. Hit that bell icon, because trust me, you won't want to miss what we're uncovering next. The story of how one song changed everything for an artist who thought their career was over. And this time, it involves a secret that was hidden for 50 years. Thanks for watching, and remember, the most important conversations are often the hardest ones to have.